A dying woman whispered a powerful family name in her sleep, and the cowboy who saved her suddenly realized the blizzard wasn't the most dangerous thing chasing her. Snow slammed against Wyatt's face as he stumbled through a waist-high drift, one arm wrapped around an unconscious woman he'd found buried beneath the storm. Her frozen hand suddenly tightened around his coat. A faint whisper escaped her cracked lips. Then, somewhere behind the screaming wind, came the distant sound of hoofbeats. Wyatt turned toward the white darkness, but saw nothing at all. "Before we begin, tell me, would you have stopped to save a stranger in that storm?" The wind came down from the Bitterroot Mountains like it had a score to settle. By noon, the sky over Montana Territory had vanished behind blowing snow. Fence posts disappeared, pine trees bent under the weight of ice. The trail leading east toward Cedar Pass looked less like a road and more like a white river swallowing everything in its path. Wyatt Mercer pulled his coat tighter around his neck and urged his gelding forward. The horse lowered its head against the storm. "Easy, Ranger," Wyatt muttered. His voice disappeared into the wind. At 43, Wyatt had seen enough winters to know when a storm meant trouble. This one meant death, the kind that left wagons buried until spring and men remembered only by the names carved on church stones. He should have been heading home. The cattle were already secured. The barn doors were barred. The woodpile was stacked beside the cabin. But one section of fence near Cedar Pass had not been checked since yesterday, and habit was stronger than comfort. Ever since losing his wife to fever 7 years earlier, habit was what carried him through most days. The storm thickened. Then Ranger stopped. Wyatt frowned. The horse rarely refused a command. He followed the animal's gaze. At first he saw nothing, only snow. Then a dark shape appeared through the white curtain. A wagon, half buried, tilted against a drift. Wyatt swung down from the saddle. Snow reached his knees immediately. The wagon was expensive, not something a ranch family would own. The paint beneath the ice was deep green. Brass trim still gleamed through the frost. One wheel had snapped clean off. No horses, no driver, no movement. Wyatt scanned the area. The storm howled around him. Then he spotted something. A line in the snow. Not footprints. A body dragged by wind. His pulse tightened. He pushed forward. 20 yards beyond the wagon, he found her. She lay on her side, nearly hidden beneath the drift. Dark curls frozen with ice. One glove missing. Her face pale from the cold. For a second, she looked like part of the mountain itself. Wyatt dropped to one knee. He pulled off a glove and pressed 2 fingers against her neck. Nothing. Then a faint flutter. Weak, but there. "Still here," he said quietly. He wasted no time. He wrapped her in his own heavy coat and lifted her from the snow. She weighed less than he expected. The wind fought him every step back to the horse. By the time he secured her in front of the saddle, ice had formed across his beard. The ride home felt endless. Twice Ranger nearly lost footing. Once Wyatt thought they would both disappear into a drift. But just before dark, Cedar Run Ranch emerged from the storm. A cabin, a barn, a lantern glowing faintly through frost-covered glass. Home. He carried the woman inside. The warmth from the stove barely touched the room. Still, it was better than the mountain. Much better. Wyatt worked carefully. He hung wet clothing near the fire, added fresh logs, heated water, wrapped blankets around her. Hours passed. Outside, the storm rattled the cabin walls. Inside, only the crackling of pine logs filled the silence. Near midnight, her eyelids moved. Wyatt looked up from the chair beside the stove. Slowly, she opened her eyes. Gray-brown eyes, alert despite exhaustion, confused, afraid. She tried to sit up. The room spun immediately. "Easy," Wyatt said. She froze. Her hand gripped the blanket. "Where am I?" "Cedar Run Ranch." She looked around. The iron stove, the coffee pot hanging above it, the shelf lined with worn books, the rifle mounted above the doorway. Then her gaze settled on him. "Who are you?" "Wyatt Mercer." For a moment neither spoke. The storm filled the silence. Finally he asked, "You got a name?" She hesitated, long enough for him to notice. "Savannah," she said. Another pause. "Savannah Brooks." It sounded true, and somehow not complete. Wyatt nodded anyway. "You hungry?" She looked down at her hands, then toward the fire. "A little." He brought her a bowl of stew left from the previous evening. She accepted it carefully. Not like someone starving. Like someone raised to mind her manners even when exhausted. That caught his attention. Most people rescued from a blizzard didn't sit straight and thank you before taking a spoonful. But Savannah did. For the next day, the storm kept them trapped. Then another day passed. The snow piled against the cabin windows. The world beyond Cedar Run vanished. They spoke little. She never volunteered information. He never pushed. Yet questions gathered quietly between them. Where had she come from? Why had she been traveling alone? Why did she look over her shoulder every time the wind struck the walls? The second night arrived colder than the first. Wyatt slept in the chair near the stove. Sometime after midnight, a sound pulled him awake. A whisper. Barely audible. Savannah was asleep. Her brow tightened. Her hands clenched the blanket. Then she spoke again. One word. A name. Caldwell. Wyatt sat motionless. The name hit him immediately. Everyone in Montana knew it. The Caldwell family owned land, cattle, rail interests, and more money than most people could imagine. Their influence stretched across state lines. What was a woman stranded in a blizzard doing, connected to people like that? Savannah's breathing quickened. "Please," she whispered. Then silence. The storm continued outside. Wyatt stared into the darkness beyond the stove. Questions settled heavily in the room, and for the first time since bringing her home, he began to wonder whether the mountain had delivered more than a stranger to his door. Because whatever Savannah Brooks was running from, it had followed her all the way into the Bitterroot Mountains. The storm finally loosened its grip on the fourth morning. The sky remained gray, but sunlight pushed through in thin streaks between the clouds. Snow covered the valley in smooth white blankets. The world looked peaceful now, as if it had forgotten what it had tried to do 3 days earlier. Wyatt stepped onto the porch with a tin cup of coffee warming his hands. The cold bit at his face. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Savannah stepped outside. She wore one of Wyatt's old wool coats. The sleeves were too long. She folded them back carefully before standing beside the porch rail. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. They watched smoke rise from the barn chimney and drift across the frozen pasture. "You always get up this early?" Savannah asked. Wyatt shrugged. "Cattle don't care much for sleeping in." A faint smile touched her face. It was the first time he'd seen one. Later that morning, she followed him to the barn. The horses accepted her surprisingly quickly. She moved around them with quiet confidence. Not nervous, not careless. Like someone who had spent years around livestock. Wyatt noticed everything. The way she checked a hoof before entering a stall. The way she spoke softly to Ranger. The way she examined feed bins without being asked. Most travelers couldn't tell hay from straw. Savannah could. By afternoon, she had repaired a torn saddle blanket with neat stitching. The next day, she organized shelves in the pantry. Flour on one side, beans and dried apples on another, coffee stored away from moisture. The cabin slowly changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. A curtain tied properly. A lantern cleaned. A table no longer buried beneath old receipts and supply notes. The place felt lived in again. Wyatt found himself noticing that more than he expected. One evening, he returned from checking fence lines and found Savannah sitting at the kitchen table. An open ledger lay before her, his ranch ledger. She immediately closed it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I wasn't snooping." Wyatt pulled out a chair. "You understand account books?" Savannah hesitated, then nodded. "A little." He slid the ledger back toward her. "Tell me what you see." She studied the pages. Only a minute passed. Then she pointed toward several entries. "You're paying too much for feed deliveries." Another page. "Your freight charges doubled after October." Another. "This supplier is charging you twice for the same shipment." Wyatt stared. He had missed all three. She noticed them in less than 5 minutes. "That's more than a little," he said quietly. Savannah lowered her eyes. For a moment it seemed she regretted saying anything. The mystery around her only deepened. 3 days later, the mountain road reopened. The first visitor arrived shortly after noon. Old Ben Harper, the region's mail carrier. His wagon rattled into the yard carrying parcels, newspapers, and winter notices from town. Ben climbed down slowly, brushing snow from his coat. "Thought I'd find you frozen solid up here," he told Wyatt. "Disappointed?" "Little bit." The old man laughed. Then he noticed Savannah standing near the porch. His smile faded. Not because of her, because of what hung around her neck. A silver pendant. Simple. Oval-shaped. The chain peeked out from beneath her collar. Ben froze. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Savannah instinctively touched the pendant. "You all right?" Wyatt asked. Ben looked from Savannah to the necklace, then back again. "Where'd you get that?" Savannah's shoulders tightened. "It belonged to my father." Ben exhaled slowly. The color drained from his face. "I'll be damned." Wyatt frowned. "What is it?" Old Ben removed his hat. His gaze never left Savannah. "I've seen that pendant before." The wind moved through the yard. The horses shifted inside the barn. Savannah stood perfectly still. Ben swallowed. "You are Savannah Brooks." It wasn't a question. It was certainty. Silence followed, long and heavy. Wyatt looked toward her. She didn't answer immediately. Finally, she nodded. Old Ben lowered himself onto the porch step. "My God." Wyatt waited. The old mail carrier rubbed a hand across his beard. "Half the territory heard about that accident." "What accident?" Wyatt asked. Ben looked at Savannah first. Giving her one final chance to stop him. She didn't. So he continued. Blackstone Valley Ranch. The name hung in the cold air. One of the biggest ranches in Wyoming. Wyatt had heard of it. Everybody had. "You were supposed to be dead." Savannah looked toward the distant mountains. "I know." Ben shook his head. "The newspapers said your carriage went off a canyon road. It did. And yet here you are." Savannah's fingers tightened around the pendant. For the first time since Wyatt had met her, genuine fear appeared in her eyes. Not panic, not weakness. Fear. The kind carried for months, maybe longer. "There wasn't supposed to be a survivor," she said quietly. Neither man interrupted. Snow slipped from the barn roof somewhere behind them. The sound echoed through the yard. Savannah finally looked at Wyatt. The truth stood between them now. I didn't leave Wyoming by choice. Her voice was steady, but only barely. Someone wanted me gone. The words settled heavily. No one spoke for several seconds. Then old Ben stood. Slowly, carefully. Like a man realizing he had just stepped into something far bigger than a mail route through the mountains. That night, Wyatt checked the livestock before bed. The moon reflected off fresh snow. Everything seemed normal, until he reached the far fence line. He stopped. Several tracks crossed the road below Cedar Run Ranch. Horse tracks, fresh. Not his, not Ben Harper's. At least 3 riders, maybe 4. Wyatt crouched beside them. The snow around the prints had not yet hardened. Whoever made them had passed through recently. Very recently. The cold wind moved across the valley. Far off in the darkness, a coyote called. Wyatt straightened slowly, then looked toward the warm glow of the cabin window, toward the woman inside. Someone knew Savannah Brooks was alive, and someone had started looking for her. Wyatt did not mention the tracks until morning. The sun rose pale over Cedar Run Ranch. Light reflected off miles of snow, bright enough to make a man squint. Smoke drifted from the chimney while coffee simmered on the stove. Savannah sat at the kitchen table with a cup between her hands. She looked tired, not from lack of sleep, from carrying something too heavy for too long. Wyatt placed his hat on the table. There were riders here last night. Her fingers stopped moving. For a second, she simply stared at the steam rising from the coffee. Then she nodded, not surprised, not confused, just resigned. How many? 3? Maybe 4. She looked toward the frost-covered window. They found me faster than I expected. Neither spoke for a while. The ticking of the clock on the wall filled the room. Finally, Wyatt pulled out a chair. You want to tell me who they are? Savannah let out a slow breath. I suppose I owe you that. Outside, the barn doors creaked in the wind. Inside, the fire popped softly. My father died last summer, she said. He wasn't my birth father. He raised me after my mother passed away. Wyatt listened. He owned Blackstone Valley. I know the name. She nodded. When he died, the ranch became mine. The words sounded simple, but nothing in her face suggested simplicity. There was a will, signed properly, witnessed, recorded. What happened? Harlan Pierce happened. The name seemed bitter in her mouth. He managed the ranch for years. Everyone trusted him. She stared into her coffee. My father trusted him too. Wyatt already knew how those stories usually ended. Harlan expected the ranch to become his. It didn't. No. The corner of her mouth tightened. When the will was read, everything changed. The room grew quiet again. Then Savannah told him about the carriage, the trip, the canyon road, the frightened driver, the sudden panic of horses, the crash, the darkness afterward. When she finished, Wyatt sat back in his chair. So Harlan wanted the ranch. He wanted control. The difference mattered. They both knew it. A ranch that size meant land, cattle, water rights, contracts, and influence stretching across several counties. Harlan had not been chasing money. He had been chasing power. The following afternoon, the riders arrived. Wyatt spotted them first. 3 figures emerging from the tree line below the ridge. Their horses moved slowly, confidently, like men who expected to be welcomed. Savannah saw them through the window. All color left her face. She stood so quickly the chair nearly tipped over. It's them. Wyatt rose. Stay inside. He stepped onto the porch. The cold air hit hard. The riders stopped near the gate. The man in front wore a dark coat and a black hat dusted with snow. Even from a distance, there was something polished about him. Controlled. Dangerous in the way quiet men often were. Morning, the stranger called. Wyatt said nothing. The man smiled. Harland Pierce. There it was. The name that had crossed hundreds of miles to reach Cedar Run. You've got someone staying with you. Still, Wyatt said nothing. Harland glanced toward the cabin. She belongs at home. Does she? The smile faded slightly. Miss Brooks has been dead for 6 months. The statement hung in the cold air. One of the riders behind him shifted in the saddle. Harland continued. The legal matters have already been settled. Wyatt leaned one shoulder against the porch post. Funny thing about dead people. Harland's eyes narrowed. They tend to stay dead. For the first time, silence fell between them. Harland studied him carefully, measuring him, trying to decide what kind of man he was. Finally, he reached into his coat. Not for a weapon. For an envelope. He tossed it onto the snow near the porch. A week, Wyatt didn't move. A week for Savannah Brooks to return voluntarily. And if she doesn't? Harland's smile returned. Colder now. The railroad company is prepared to purchase Blackstone Valley. Something flickered in Savannah's face behind the window. Fear. Not for herself, for something else. The families living there lose everything, Harland said. Homes, jobs, land leases. Then he tipped his hat. Think carefully. The riders turned and disappeared back toward the trees. The sound of hooves slowly faded. Wyatt picked up the envelope. Inside was a legal notice. Railroad acquisition papers. Dates, signatures, official stamps. Everything looked legitimate, which made it worse. That evening, darkness settled over the ranch early. Savannah stood alone beside the corral fence. The sky above Montana was filled with stars. Wyatt found her there. She didn't turn when he approached. I have to go back. He had expected those words. Still, hearing them felt different. If I stay here, they'll take everything. She looked out across the snowy pasture. The people at Blackstone Valley aren't numbers on a ledger. Her voice softened. I grew up with them. A long pause followed. Then she looked at him. I won't drag you into this. Wyatt rested both hands on the fence rail. For several seconds he watched the horses moving in the moonlight. Then he spoke. 10 years ago my younger brother died. Savannah turned toward him. He rarely talked about himself. Almost never. We argued over a piece of land. His voice remained steady. There was a gun between us. The wind moved through the fence posts. I didn't mean for it to happen. Savannah said nothing. He appreciated that. I buried him. Buried my parents a few years later. Buried my wife after the fever. His gaze stayed on the horizon. After a while, you start believing you're not supposed to keep anything good. The words disappeared into the night. Savannah lowered her eyes. Then, very gently, she touched his sleeve. Only for a second. Just enough. Neither spoke again. They stood there listening to the horses breathe, listening to the winter wind moving across the valley. The next morning, Savannah packed her small bag, the same bag she had arrived with. Wyatt saddled Ranger before sunrise. When she stepped onto the porch, she stopped. You don't have to do this. Wyatt tightened the saddle strap. Probably not. Wyatt, I'm coming. The answer was simple. Final. Savannah looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Together they mounted their horses. The Bitterroot Mountains stretched behind them. Wyoming waited somewhere beyond the frozen plains, and Blackstone Valley was running out of time. The journey took 9 days, 9 mornings of frozen saddle leather, 9 evenings of weak coffee boiled over campfires and blankets that smelled faintly of wood smoke. Winter slowly loosened its grip the farther south they traveled. Snow still covered the valleys, but patches of brown earth had begun to appear along the road. Streams whispered beneath sheets of thinning ice. Most nights, Wyatt and Savannah said little. The silence between them had changed. It no longer felt like distance. It felt like understanding. One evening near the state line, Savannah handed Wyatt a tin cup of coffee. He accepted it with a quiet nod. "You don't have to stay once we get there," she said. Wyatt stared into the dark liquid. "I know." She waited. He never said anything more. For some reason, that answer meant more than if he had promised. 3 days later, they reached the ridge above Blackstone Valley. Savannah pulled her horse to a stop. Below them stretched thousands of acres of ranch land, rolling pasture, long fences, red barns, windmills turning slowly beneath a pale spring sky. For a moment, she simply stared. This had once been home. Now it looked unfamiliar. The large ranch house still stood at the center of the valley. But something had changed. Several fences had fallen into disrepair. The south pasture sat nearly empty. Smoke drifted from buildings her father had always kept busy. Yet somehow the entire ranch felt quieter, colder, as though the life had been drained from it. "Harlan's been cutting costs," Wyatt said. Savannah nodded. She could see it too. The next morning they rode into town. The spring meeting at the courthouse had already begun. Ranchers filled the room. Merchants lined the back wall. Lawyers sat near the front carrying folders tied with string. The room buzzed with conversation. Then the door opened. Savannah stepped inside. Silence followed immediately. Every voice stopped. A chair scraped against the floor. Someone dropped a pencil. For several seconds, nobody moved. Several people stared as though they were looking at a ghost. An elderly ranch wife pressed a hand against her chest. "Lord above," someone whispered. Savannah continued walking. Her shoulders remained straight, her chin level. She did not rush. At the front of the room, Harlan Pierce slowly stood. The color drained from his face, then disappeared behind a practiced smile. "Miss Brooks," he said. The room remained silent. "I suppose rumors of your death were exaggerated." Savannah stopped several feet away. "No." Her voice carried clearly. "My death was simply convenient." Several people exchanged uneasy glances. Harlan laughed softly, too softly. "As you can see," he said to the room, "Miss Brooks is alive and well." He lifted a stack of papers. "Which changes nothing." The smile returned, confident, calculated. A lawyer beside him opened a leather folder. One document after another appeared. Contracts, ownership records, transfer agreements. Each carried signatures, official seals, witness statements. Everything looked legitimate. Everything pointed toward Harlan. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Savannah felt the ground shifting beneath her. This was worse than she feared. Harlan had prepared for this. For months. At the front table sat Judge Milton Reeves. The old judge adjusted his spectacles and studied the papers carefully. He had known Savannah's father for years, long enough to recognize his handwriting, long enough to know when something felt wrong. Yet even he seemed uncertain. The documents looked convincing. Harlan folded his hands. As unfortunate as Miss Brooks's disappearance was, business had to continue. The lawyer nodded. The ownership transition was completed legally. Several heads in the room began to nod. Savannah felt her stomach tighten. For the first time since surviving the blizzard, doubt crept in. Then the courthouse door opened again. Every head turned. An older woman entered carrying a worn wooden box. Her gray hair was pinned neatly beneath a bonnet. Her steps were slow but determined. Savannah froze. "Martha?" Martha Green looked at her and smiled. The same smile Savannah remembered from childhood. The woman who had bandaged scraped knees, baked birthday pies, read stories during thunderstorms. Martha walked directly to the judge. "I believe these belong to the court." She placed the wooden box on the table. Inside lay a sealed envelope. Judge Reeves carefully broke the seal. The room watched in silence. He unfolded the document. Read. Then read again. Harlan's confidence vanished. Judge Reeves slowly looked up. "This," he said quietly, "appears to be Arthur Brooks's original will." The room erupted. Voices rose. Questions flew from every direction. Harlan stepped backward. For the first time, fear appeared in his eyes. Savannah felt tears threatening. Not from victory, from relief. Martha had protected the truth all this time. Across the room, Wyatt met Savannah's eyes. Neither smiled. Neither needed to. The look was enough. The hearing was postponed until morning. People poured into the streets, talking all at once. News spread through town before sunset. Savannah Brooks was alive, and Harlan Pierce might lose everything. That evening, Wyatt returned from the stable behind the hotel. The street lamps had already been lit. The town sat beneath a sky filled with stars. Something felt wrong. The hallway outside Savannah's room stood empty. Her door hung slightly open. Wyatt's pulse quickened. He pushed it wider. The room was dark, silent. The bed untouched. The window open. Cold air drifting inside. On the floor lay a familiar blue shawl. Savannah's. Wyatt picked it up slowly. The fabric was still warm. Outside, somewhere beyond the edge of town, a horse whinnied in the darkness. And suddenly, the victory that had seemed so close no longer felt certain at all. Wyatt stood motionless in Savannah's hotel room. The blue shawl rested in his hands. Cold air drifted through the open window. On the floor below it, he found a broken button and fresh mud tracked across the boards. Not much, but enough. Someone had taken her, and they had moved fast. By sunrise, the town was awake. News spread through Blackstone Valley faster than any newspaper ever could. Savannah Brooks had returned from the dead, then vanished again. Judge Milton Reeves joined Wyatt outside the livery stable. Old Martha Green stood nearby, her face pale but determined. "They won't keep her in town," Martha said quietly. "They'll take her somewhere private." Wyatt nodded. He was already thinking the same thing. Harlan Pierce had spent months building his lies. He would not risk everything inside a crowded town. One of the ranch hands approached from across the street. His name was Eli Turner. He had worked at Blackstone Valley since he was 16. "I saw riders heading toward Copper Ridge before dawn," he said. "How many?" "4. That was enough." By mid-morning, 5 ranchers rode out with Wyatt. None of them came because of money. They came because Harlan had spent years treating honest people like tools. The ride into the canyon took most of the day. Copper Ridge rose above them in layers of red stone and broken cliffs. At its center sat an abandoned copper mine that had not operated in nearly 20 years. The entrance looked like a dark scar in the hillside. Wyatt saw tethered horses first, then smoke from a small fire. He dismounted. The others followed. Nobody spoke much. There was no need. Inside the old mine office, Savannah sat at a rough table. Her wrists were not tied. Harland had learned something important. She could not be forced, only pressured. A stack of documents sat before her. Transfer papers, ownership records, the final pieces of his scheme. Harland stood across from her. His coat was dusty, his eyes tired. Desperate men always looked tired eventually. "You sign those papers," he said, "and this all ends." Savannah looked at the documents, then at him. No. The answer came without hesitation. Harland laughed once, a harsh sound. "You still don't understand." "I understand perfectly." She folded her hands. "You never wanted the ranch." His expression tightened. "You wanted control." Silence filled the room. For the first time, Harland looked older than he had before, like a man carrying the weight of every bad decision he had ever made. Then the door opened. Wyatt stepped inside. Their eyes met immediately. Neither smiled. Neither moved. But something eased in Savannah's face. Something that had been tight since the hotel room. Harland turned slowly. "So you found us." Wyatt's gaze never left Savannah. "You all right?" She nodded. That was enough. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the ranch hands stepped forward. Then another. And another. Harland looked around the room. The realization came gradually. The people standing there were not strangers. They were workers, neighbors, men who had spent years watching him take more than he gave. Eli Turner removed his hat. "We're done helping you, Harland." The room fell silent again. Harland stared at him, then at the others. One by one, they looked away, not from fear, from disappointment. It seemed to hit harder. The fight went out of him, not all at once, but enough. His shoulders lowered. The papers on the table suddenly looked small, meaningless. Judge Reeves arrived before sunset with the county marshal. Harland surrendered without argument. By nightfall, it was over. The truth was no longer hiding. The original will was recognized. The false documents were thrown out. Blackstone Valley belonged to Savannah Brooks, at last. Spring arrived fully in the weeks that followed. Snow melted from the hills. Grass returned to the lower pastures. Repair crews fixed broken fences. Cattle moved back into grazing fields. Life returned. The valley seemed to breathe again. For a while, Wyatt stayed, long enough to help rebuild damaged corrals, long enough to repair a roof above one of the bunkhouses, long enough to watch Savannah become exactly what her father had believed she could be. People listened when she spoke, not because she owned the ranch, because she earned their trust. Then one morning, Wyatt saddled Ranger before dawn. The valley still slept. The eastern sky glowed faintly pink. His bedroll was tied behind the saddle, his few belongings packed neatly inside a weathered leather bag. He had almost finished tightening the cinch when he heard footsteps. Savannah. She stopped beside the fence. Neither spoke for a moment. Birds called from the cottonwoods near the creek. "You were leaving without saying goodbye." Wyatt lowered his eyes. "I figured it'd be easier." "For who?" He didn't answer, because he knew. For him, not for her. Savannah reached into her coat, then handed him a folded document. Wyatt frowned. "What is this? Open it." He unfolded the paper. His expression changed immediately. A land deed. One section of Blackstone Valley. His name written clearly across the top. Wyatt stared at it, then looked at her. "I can't take this." Yes, you can. Why? Savannah stepped closer. The morning breeze lifted a loose strand of hair beside her cheek. Because everyone else wanted the ranch. You're the only one who wanted me alive. The words settled between them. Simple. Honest. Nothing dramatic. Nothing rehearsed. Just truth. Wyatt looked away first. Toward the valley. Toward the ranch. Toward a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. For 10 years he had carried guilt like a second shadow. For 10 years he had believed leaving was easier than staying. Savannah waited. She didn't ask him to choose. She didn't beg. She simply stood there, giving him the dignity of deciding for himself. Finally, Wyatt folded the deed, then slipped it into his coat pocket. Ranger snorted softly beside him. The saddle remained on the horse, but Wyatt never climbed into it. 1 year later, Blackstone Valley looked different. A new schoolhouse stood near the creek. Several ranch families had built homes on land they once rented. The barns were full, the fences strong, the valley alive. On an autumn afternoon, golden leaves drifted across the pasture, while Savannah and Wyatt rode side by side along a newly repaired fence line. The mountains stood blue in the distance, the same mountains that had once sent a blizzard across Montana, the same storm that had nearly ended everything before it began. Savannah glanced toward Wyatt. You ever think about that day? The storm? She nodded. Wyatt smiled. Just slightly. Every now and then. They rode on, no longer running, no longer hiding. The wind moved gently through the tall grass, and for the first time in a very long while, both of them were exactly where they belonged. As I think about Wyatt and Savannah riding across that valley, I keep coming back to one simple thought. Neither of them found what they were looking for. Wyatt wasn't searching for love. He was trying to survive another winter. Savannah wasn't searching for a future. She was trying to escape a past that refused to let go. Yet somehow, on a mountain buried under snow, their paths crossed. And maybe that's what stays with me most. Not the ranch, not the inheritance, not even the fight to reclaim it. It's the quiet moments, a cup of coffee shared before sunrise, a lantern glowing in a lonely cabin. Someone choosing to stay when walking away would have been easier. If you place yourself in Wyatt's boots for a moment, carrying years of regret, would you have believed there could still be a place waiting for you? And if you were Savannah, after losing trust in so many people, would you have found the courage to trust again? Sometimes healing doesn't arrive as a grand miracle. Sometimes it arrives as a person who sees your scars and sits down beside you anyway. That's the gift at the heart of this story. Not perfection, not rescue, just two wounded souls finding a reason to stop running. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you had been in Wyatt's or Savannah's place, what choice do you think you would have made? And if stories like this bring you a little peace at the end of the day, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more journeys waiting before us on the next horizon. Stories of courage, second chances, and the unexpected ways people find their way home.